It means a lot to us to be there for survivors, because I always talk about how the onus of all support lands on the survivor. Like, you have to flee, you have to change jobs, you have to go to shelter, you have to find a lawyer, and we want to be a piece of that. And many of you on this call helping do that critical support are helping us remove those barriers. In addition to the onus falling on the survivor, we know of a lot of other barriers like immigration status, or not speaking the primary language to get services. Maybe you're relying on your abuser to pay your bills. Maybe you don't even recognize you're being abused. A lot of clients say, well, he didn't hit me, or they didn't put their hands on me, and they don't think about the other ways that the law recognizes where there is domestic violence happening. And a lot of times our clients are experiencing things like mental health issues, or they have a disability, or they might be on the brink of homelessness. Now, I'm really glad that we're looking at homelessness statistics with the lens of domestic violence and seeing how many folks are homeless because of that abuse, and funds are getting targeted to support folks. Eve, what about other barriers that you've seen for domestic violence survivors?
So I think something to understand is we talk a lot about, the phrase is, why don't victims leave? And Carmen outlined, just some of the individual reasons, but there are a number of systemic barriers that also prevent survivors from finding a pathway to safety and to security. And that is another area where LACLJ is so critical. But a lot of people don't necessarily understand the scope of those systemic barriers. When they have what's called the coordinated entry system for homelessness. So people say, well, you should leave so someone has nowhere to go, right? So the leading cause of homelessness for women is because women are fleeing domestic violence. So oftentimes they are in a situation where their choice is be homeless or be harmed, right? Not a fair choice under any circumstance. Mm-hmm. But the homeless system has an entry process which involves filling out a screening tool. And the screening tool really, as it was rolled out, the way it was developed really didn't enable survivors to score high enough to get to the top of the list. So there's been very active advocacy to try to change that. And
some other systemic barriers you mentioned that LACLJ has been involved with removing for survivors is there's a bill that allows for a survivor to get a free copy of their police report. And the way that the statute was written, it said if you're a survivor of domestic violence. But what happens when someone makes a police report is the crime that's listed at the top of the report might say disturbing the peace. It might say assault. It just has some word that a person receiving the report wrote down. So if it didn't say domestic violence, even though the issue was domestic violence, our survivors couldn't get a free copy. Then you had to send a letter to some records division that could take 2 to 4 weeks to obtain. But that restraining order hearing comes quickly. It comes in 21 days, and you might not have that critical evidence to support your TRO or to file your U visa if there's an immigration issue. And so we really know that the barriers are so big that we're trying to remove them at every level that we can. And in partnering with folks like the Domestic Violence Council, we're able to try to take things to the next level. We're really passionate about providing, like I said, that critical representation. We distinguish ourselves from other providers by not having a clinical model where you might just do a form or a piece of paper for someone. Because what I've experienced throughout my 20 years in doing survivor work is the question is, are you going to go to court with me? Are you going to be there with me when I'm in front of the judge and the abuser or the immigration official or the police officer asking about the rape that happened to me? And it's horrible to say no. And we say no a lot. We cannot meet the need of every survivor that calls us, but we try to say yes when we can. Or we say, here's how. We're going to place your case with pro bono. We're going to make sure we send our social work intern to accompany you. We're going to do our best to be there at those critical hearings with clients. And then we try to make sure we're following up with that systemic change or that appellate case that we need to do to make sure we change the law for all survivors to try to make it a little bit easier.
And all of this really feeds on the abuse itself, right? So someone who is in an abusive relationship, regardless of even if there's physical abuse, is being told all the time, no one's going to believe you, you have no way out, we can't, there's nothing you can do, they'll take the children from you, you're a terrible parent, and so forth. So when someone actually shows up to talk to someone to seek help, the fact that that person is supportive, does believe you, is willing to try to find something, can be very life-changing for people. And similarly, you know, when they go to some of these, you know, they show up and the sheriff says, show up to get your documents served, and then some person from law enforcement is doing some substantive review of your documents. Again, you know, it's not only what's happening in front of you, but it's what's circling around in your head, which is all the things that this abusive person has said to you, right? So they've said, this is never going to work out for you. You're never going to be able to leave. If you do leave, you're going to have all of these problems. So all of these things that LACLJ does really lifts that level of, you know, fear and distrust, that it is one of the tools that is used by someone who's abusive to keep someone in, as a means of power control, to keep someone in the relationship. So reality is that for survivors of DV, not only is the burden, as Carmen said to start with, the burden is almost 100% on the survivor, and the expectation of society is that the burden is on the survivor, because there's really no other kind of thing where someone who discloses this kind of conduct to someone where people say, well, what did you do, right? So in this one, they say, you know, did you do something to cause it? What was your reaction? Why don't you leave? How come you're, you know, what's happening at your job, and so forth. So really we have a very victim blaming system. So all of these supports where someone has a moment to breathe, to be able to say, okay, I can really open up here. I know someone here will help me and really help me analyze this about what's the right thing for me to do now, is invaluable, not only because it provides a person with sort of a roadway to get away from the abuse, but it also is a way for them to heal. So all of the services that are provided are really, you know, both personal and, you know, professional in the way that they're provided. You know, it's legal services, but it's also much, much more. I had worked both for the county and then prior to that for the city, and I ran the city's coalition and then ultimately the county's DV coalition. So I've had a lot of interaction I was often sort of the liaison between the field and then the government. There's an assumption, I think everybody's like, oh, everybody knows domestic violence is a bad thing and we should support it. And you can go into any number of even, you know, non-DV rooms, so to speak, and everybody feels terrible about, you know, domestic violence exists and so forth. But the reality is it's a very, very low priority on the funding scale. So things that are funded, and it's often not looked at, like domestic violence was not looked at as part of homelessness, despite the fact that it actually is part of homelessness. And so DV was cut out of a lot of funding. So by the time policymakers sort of get around to DV, it's often very little amount. So the county had no general funding. No, none of their general funds dedicated to DV, with limited exception. They funded the Domestic Violence Council, but they didn't have any general funds allotted to DV until, I think they're doing that now. And it was only due to a tremendous level of advocacy and outrage, frankly, on the part of the field, in order to say you have to dedicate money to this, right? Because you have to, it's intergenerational, it causes all sorts, and it's connected to all sorts of other issues and so forth. But the same thing on the city side, when I was, I ran the city's DV coalition, we went back to the city government, who now actually spends a reasonable amount of their general fund on DV, but really having to prove what it costs, what they were paying, even with government funding, per night to house a survivor, a DV survivor, versus everybody else who was receiving similar care. So it was something like they were spending, I think it was $11 to $13 per night for a survivor, but $50 a night for someone who was homeless. So it's taken tremendous advocacy really in the last few years, right? So this is something that's been ongoing. So I think there's a belief oftentimes when people talk about funding for agencies that support survivors and victims of sexual assault, that somehow they're really well funded, but they are not. And it is very difficult to get every kind of funding that comes is divided across all agencies throughout the county or the city. So it's very, very difficult for agencies to find the funding that they need and to find funding that they can use for the things that they need. So even if they have a really tremendous innovative idea, which LACLJ has had a number of, or they're doing work in areas where other people are not doing work, those things which are great to look at, but they also are the hardest challenge, right, to get funding for.
We have had a lot of success reaching out for funding that targets PTSD or disabilities, or targets homelessness prevention, or targets custody cases, to try to cobble together that our organization that does all the things that we know survivors need. But it is very reactive to the demands of the funder versus the funder saying, how more can we support your work? Which is why then we really turn to our supporters and we run domestic violence campaigns like we're doing now, and we look to pro bono support to fill many of those gaps. Attorney's amazing pro bono panel, but here's the ways that you can continue to support us with pro bono work. We do provide that critical representation at a restraining order hearing. This is the first time a judge often hears from a survivor, and when the story isn't told properly, or it's not focused, or it's not pled properly, the judges don't forget. They make notes, and it follows a client through the life of a case. I'll never forget one of the first cases when I came to LACLJ as a family law supervisor. The attorney felt too busy to go into court like in 2 days. And 5 years later, we were still litigating that case. So we've tried to restructure it so that our attorneys can go into that first hearing, or we can get a pro bono in there, because I'm certain it wouldn't have been 5 years of litigation had we been in there initially. Because what happened is her abuser came in with a pro bono, with a hired attorney, and convinced her to drop her restraining order.
Questions. Sometimes people have questions about domestic violence that they're not comfortable asking in a group, because it may be misinterpreted, or it's something that someone who's not in the field never understood. So you should feel free to contact either of us. I say it's cone of silence. It's not, legally confidential, but it is important to be able to talk openly about what's going on with people who have had experience in the field, just to sort of deepen your understanding or address things that may not make sense to you. It's a very counterintuitive field, and that's a lot of the legislative work we do and so forth, that we look at things because things can often on their face appear to be backwards. And so please feel free to reach out, whether it be, and given the numbers, the other part of it is, I've had many people contact me just because a friend of a friend or something like that just doesn't know what to do, doesn't know what to say. And oftentimes it just takes a conversation of, what words can you use? What's the best way to reach out? What do you tell someone? So forth. So please know that in addition to all these phenomenal services, I'm volunteering Carmen and the other lawyers, but I know these people and they're all really do this phenomenally well, and myself as well. If there are any questions, please feel free to reach out, because it's important. The depth of your understanding matters.